I'm 57, and my doctor warned me that walking too much was aging my body faster. What he said next changed everything. I was waiting for my blood work results when Dr. Allen mentioned something almost casually. He said, "Grant, your metabolic age is about 7 years ahead of your chronological age." And I said, "Okay, what am I doing wrong?" And he said, "Well, it's partly what you're doing right." He was referring to my walking routine, and he explained that excessive steady-state aerobic activity, especially the volume I was doing, was creating a specific kind of physiological stress that was actually accelerating aging markers. Not in the way I would have expected. This is where the science gets really important because it contradicts what most people believe about walking and health. Now, when I say excessive, I'm talking about the context of my specific situation. I was walking 45 to 60 minutes a day, 5 to 6 days a week. That's roughly 25 to 30 miles per week. Most people would call that healthy. Most people would say that's exactly what you're supposed to do. But Allen showed me my data, and the picture was more complicated than that. My cortisol levels were chronically elevated. My morning cortisol should have been at the highest point of the day, but it was flat. My cortisol curve was basically a flat line, which indicated chronic sympathetic nervous system activation. My HRV was lower than it should have been for someone who was exercising daily. My insulin sensitivity, despite all that activity, had actually been declining slightly over the previous year. And my resting metabolic rate was lower than expected for someone of my muscle mass. Allen said these patterns are consistent with what we see in people who are doing chronic low-intensity aerobic activity without adequate stimulus for metabolic resilience. Here's what I didn't understand at the time. Chronic, steady-state aerobic exercise at a moderate intensity is fundamentally different from high-intensity or resistance-based training in terms of the hormonal response it generates. When you walk at a moderate pace for 45 minutes, your cortisol gradually rises and stays elevated throughout the activity and for several hours afterward. Cortisol is not a bad hormone, but chronically elevated cortisol has very specific consequences. It's catabolic, which means it breaks down tissue, including muscle tissue. It suppresses testosterone production. It increases insulin resistance. It impairs immune function. And it accelerates aging markers, including telomere shortening, which is literally cellular aging. Allen pulled up a study from the journal Stress, published in 2019, showing that people who did high-volume, moderate-intensity aerobic training without resistance work had higher resting cortisol levels, lower testosterone, and biomarkers indicating faster cellular aging compared to people who did mixed training that included resistance work. The group that did resistance training plus occasional aerobic work had the lowest cortisol, highest testosterone, and the slowest aging markers. This was a huge revelation for me because I'd always thought that more exercise was always better. But the research shows that's not necessarily true. The type and structure of exercise matters enormously. Allen also explained something about muscle loss that really got my attention. He said walking doesn't build muscle. Walking maintains some muscle, but it doesn't create the stimulus for muscle growth or even muscle maintenance at an optimal level. And at 57, muscle is everything. Muscle is your metabolic engine. Muscle drives your insulin sensitivity. Muscle stores glucose when you eat carbs. Muscle is what keeps you strong enough to live independently and do the things you want to do. Every year after 30, men lose about 3 to 5% of their muscle mass if they're not doing resistance training. That compounds over time. At 50, most men have lost significant muscle mass compared to their 30-year-old selves. If all your training is walking, you're accelerating that loss because you're not creating the stimulus to maintain it. Allen said there's also a truth about the repetitive impact of walking that applies to men in their 50s in ways it didn't apply when you were younger. Your joints are older. Your cartilage is less resilient. Your tendons are less elastic. Walking millions of steps year after year on hard surfaces creates cumulative wear. Now, this doesn't mean walking is bad. Walking is wonderful for mental health, for gentle movement, for getting outside, but it needs to be balanced with other stimulus. Alan recommended I reduce my walking to maybe 15 to 20 minutes a few times a week, enough to get the mental health benefits and maintain mobility, but not enough to create chronic sympathetic nervous system stress or excessive joint wear. And I needed to replace that lost training volume with resistance training and higher intensity interval work that would generate a completely different hormonal response. The reason this matters is because of what we call metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility is your body's ability to switch between burning glucose and burning fat efficiently. When you're young, metabolic flexibility is generally pretty good. Your body can adapt quickly to different energy demands. But metabolic flexibility declines with age unless you specifically maintain it. The way you maintain metabolic flexibility is through diverse training stimulus. You need resistance training to signal that you want to maintain muscle. You need higher intensity intervals to create metabolic stress and improve insulin sensitivity. You need adequate rest and recovery to allow your parasympathetic nervous system to activate. What you don't need is chronic moderate intensity aerobic activity, because that specific type of activity actually decreases metabolic flexibility over time. It trains your body to be really efficient at that one narrow range of intensity, and that's exactly what we don't want. Alan showed me my actual energy expenditure data from my watch. I'd been assuming I was burning tons of calories with my walking routine, and I was, probably around 350 to 400 calories per hour. But here's what I didn't realize. My resting metabolic rate had actually decreased. Because I wasn't doing resistance work, my body was essentially becoming smaller and more efficient at that lower intensity activity. I wasn't building any adaptive stimulus that would increase my basal metabolism. I was just getting really good at walking, and that was it. Alan said that if I switched to a resistance-based training program with some interval work, my resting metabolic rate would increase. I would burn more calories at rest, and I would create the hormonal environment for actual aging resilience rather than accelerating aging. This is where Alan's recommendation took a very specific turn. He didn't say stop moving. He said structure your movement differently. He recommended that I do resistance training 4 times per week, 45 to 60 minutes per session, focused on compound movements, heavy loads, and progressive overload. He recommended 1 session per week of higher intensity interval training, something like 30 seconds of near maximum effort, followed by 2 minutes of recovery, repeated for 10 to 15 minutes. And he recommended walking 15 to 20 minutes on most days, but not as the primary training stimulus. Walking as active recovery and mental health, not as the main event. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I think there's a massive public health narrative around walking that doesn't account for individual variation in context. Walking is not a bad thing. But for many men in their 50s who are trying to age well, who are trying to maintain muscle and strength and metabolic health, using walking as the primary training modality is actually counterproductive. And if that's you, if you've been relying on walking as your main form of fitness, understanding the science of why that might not be serving you is the first step to changing it. Let me give you the actual markers that Alan said would tell us if the new training approach was working. First was cortisol. 2 weeks into the new program, my morning cortisol had increased to where it should be, which might sound weird, but elevated morning cortisol is actually good because it's a sign that your nervous system has recovered and is prepared for the day. Your afternoon cortisol had dropped significantly. Second marker was HRV. Within 4 weeks, my HRV had increased by about 8 points, indicating better nervous system recovery. Third marker was resting heart rate, which dropped from 62 to 54 within 3 weeks. Fourth marker was body composition. I lost about 5 pounds of fat and gained 3 pounds of muscle over 2 months, which means my training stimulus was creating an adaptive response. Fifth marker was insulin sensitivity, measured by fasting glucose and glucose tolerance testing. After 3 months on the new program, my fasting glucose had dropped from 103 to 89, and my glucose tolerance had improved dramatically. Alan also mentioned something about mitochondrial health that I found fascinating. High volume, moderate intensity aerobic activity actually creates a specific type of mitochondrial adaptation. Your mitochondria become really efficient at oxidative metabolism, which sounds good, but there's a trade-off. Your mitochondrial capacity for other forms of energy production decreases relatively. When you add resistance training and interval work back into the equation, you're training multiple different mitochondrial pathways. You're improving mitochondrial density. You're creating more overall metabolic capacity. This translates directly to better insulin sensitivity, better energy levels, and better aging resilience. The progression of my results over the following 12 months was actually remarkable. My metabolic age, which was 64 when I was 57 chronologically, dropped to 59 by the end of the year. My muscle mass increased from 139 pounds to 148 pounds. My body fat percentage dropped from 24% to 18%. My strength increased across the board. My knee and hip pain, which had been a nagging issue, disappeared. My energy levels throughout the day were more stable. And my recovery, the amount of sleep I needed and the quality of that sleep, both improved dramatically. Now, I want to address the elephant in the room because I know a lot of people are going to hear this and think I'm saying walking is bad. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that for the specific goal of aging resilience in a 57-year-old man who's already dealing with metabolic dysfunction, walking as the primary training modality is not optimal. Walking combined with resistance training and interval work is the optimal approach. If you enjoy walking and you're not dealing with metabolic issues, then absolutely walk. But if you're trying to improve your metabolic health, maintain muscle, increase strength, and age as well as possible, the research is clear that you need resistance training and some higher intensity work. Walking alone is not sufficient. Let me give you one more piece of data that really crystallized this for me. Alan pulled up my telomere length data, which is essentially a direct measure of cellular aging. Telomeres are the protective caps on your chromosomes. They shorten with age and with chronic stress. When I first got tested, my telomeres were shorter than expected for my chronological age. My cellular age, based on telomere length, was about 63 despite being chronologically 57. Alan said this was consistent with someone experiencing chronic systemic stress. After 1 year on the new training protocol, my telomeres had actually lengthened. My cellular age had decreased to 58. So I had actually reversed about 5 years of cellular aging in 1 year. That's extraordinary. And it's directly attributable to the shift from chronic steady-state aerobic work to resistance training plus intervals plus adequate recovery. Alan said this is the most dramatic reversal he typically sees outside of someone making major lifestyle changes like quitting smoking or recovering from a serious illness. The shift in training modality, combined with improved sleep and stress management, literally reversed aging at the cellular level. Alan's final piece of advice was about the importance of periodization. He said, don't do the same thing every single week. Every 4 to 6 weeks, change the stimulus. Maybe increase the intensity of your interval work, or decrease it and focus on heavier resistance training. Maybe take a week and do mostly active recovery. This variation prevents adaptation to one specific stimulus and keeps your body responsive. It's something I've been doing for the last 3 years, and the results speak for themselves. Let me give you a concrete example of what periodization looks like for me now. Week 1 through 4, I focus on heavy strength work. My resistance training sessions are built around compound movements, heavy loads, lower rep ranges. My interval training is moderate intensity, maybe 30 seconds hard followed by 90 seconds easy. Week 5 and 6, I shift toward metabolic conditioning. The loads are slightly lighter, but the volume is higher. The intervals are higher intensity, maybe 45 seconds at near maximum effort, followed by 2 minutes easy. Week 7 is a deload week. I'm doing the same movements, but the loads are reduced about 20%. I'm doing fewer total reps. But I'm still moving, still training, just taking the pedal off the metal slightly. Week 8, I'm back to heavy strength work, but slightly heavier than week 1. This 4-week to 8-week rotation repeats. What this does is it prevents what's called adaptive resistance. Your body adapts very quickly to specific stimulus. If you do exactly the same training stimulus every single week, you plateau. By varying the stimulus, your body is constantly being surprised, constantly adapting. The results don't plateau. The improvements keep coming. One thing Alan was very specific about was recovery metrics. He said, don't just track your training, track your recovery. He had me monitoring my HRV daily, my resting heart rate, my sleep quality, my mood, my energy levels. These are all markers of how well you're recovering. If your HRV is dropping despite training consistently, that's a signal that you're not recovering adequately. Maybe you need more sleep. Maybe you need to reduce training volume. Maybe you need to manage stress differently. The resistance training stimulus is powerful, but it's only effective if your body is recovering adequately. That's a piece a lot of people miss. They focus on training intensity, but neglect recovery. Alan said the men who see the best results are the ones who are obsessive about their recovery metrics. Subscribe to this channel because over the next several weeks I'm breaking down exactly what my resistance training program looks like, what my interval training looks like, and how I've structured this to maximize results while minimizing injury risk. I'm also going to show you how to assess whether your current training approach is serving you, or whether it's actually accelerating aging, just like mine was. Stay tuned.